Here in India, the government has announced a major decision. Export of parboiled rice will carry a 20% tax, 20% export duty. It's a very consequential decision, but I must say, not a surprising one. Rice prices have reached a 12-year high. Export of most varieties is already curbed. Plus, there are state elections around the corner. So it wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when the duty would be announced. Now, just to be clear, this export curb is not about shortages. There is no rice shortage in India, so don't rush to your grocery store. This export curb is about regulating supply. If you increase export duty, the product becomes more expensive abroad. And when that happens, fewer people buy it abroad. So the idea is to reduce exports and increase domestic supply. Hopefully, that will cool down prices. But this decision goes beyond India. It may help reduce prices in our country, but elsewhere, it could trigger a food crisis. And I'm talking about actual shortages now, not inflation, shortages. Let me explain how. India makes up around 40% of total rice exports, 40, the biggest exporter in the world. Parboiled rice is a big part of this basket. Now, what does parboiled mean? This is a variety of rice that is partially pre-cooked. It is boiled in the husk and then dried, hence parboiled. Poorer countries in Africa and Asia depend on this kind of rice because A, it's cheaper, and B, it's rich in fiber and proteins. Other countries also produce this variety, like Pakistan and Thailand. But their exports are more expensive than India's, hence the duty. Traders say this decision will level out the prices. So parboiled rice from India may cost the same as parboiled rice from Thailand or Pakistan. But how would that trigger a crisis? Because it's not just parboiled rice, it's all kinds of rice. India has now imposed export curbs on every variety of rice. Let me show you. First is basmati, the premium variety. India has set a minimum export price for basmati. The shipments must cost at least $1,200 per ton. If not, you cannot export basmati from India. And basmati makes up around 20% of India's exports. The second is parboiled rice. As we mentioned, there's a 20% duty. This variety makes up around 30% of India's exports. The third is non-basmati white rice. Now, this variety has been completely banned, zero exports. It used to make up around 30% of India's rice shipments. And finally, we have broken rice. Again, zero exports. The government imposed a total ban last year. This variety made up 20% of total shipments. So just to recap, around half of India's rice shipments have been banned. The remaining half have restrictions. Things like minimum price and duties. So naturally, the world is worried. And it's not just rice. India has curbed the export of multiple food products in the recent past. Wheat was banned last year, wheat export. Onion has a 40% export duty. And reports say sugar could be next. The government is expected to announce the decision soon. It would be India's first sugar export curb in 7 years. So what explains all these bans and duties? In one word, it's inflation. India's food inflation is in double digits. It was 11.5% in the month of July. That's the highest level in 3 years. And driven by food prices, overall inflation has shot up. It was 7.44% in July. To give you some context, the Reserve Bank of India's tolerance band is 2 to 6%. Ideally, it should be around 4%. 4% inflation is good. How do you achieve that? The RBI can always hike interest rates to bring down inflation, but there's a downside to that. Economic growth will be affected. So far, the RBI has resisted that. Earlier this month, they chose to keep the rates unchanged. The RBI governor explained why. He's playing a waiting game, basically. He's expecting vegetable prices to cool down by September. But what if they don't? What if prices rise despite these export curbs? That is the big risk for India. In fact, it's the risk for all countries. Balancing between rate hikes and growth. That's the tightrope all countries are walking. India is projected to be the fastest growing major economy in 2023. Big players like China are struggling. So now is the time to capitalize. But to do that, inflation must be brought under control. Of course, this is the worst case scenario. In the best case scenario, harvest will be good, the supply will return to normal, and prices will cool down. Who knows, maybe even the export curbs will be lifted. But even in this best case scenario, there is a problem. The problem of credibility. When you export 40% of any product, you also have a responsibility. And when it's food, even more so. Such sudden bans and duties will raise questions on India's credibility and its ability to feed the world. And I'm not saying we should sacrifice the domestic market to feed the world. I'm saying we will have to be better prepared. The difference between stable inflation and double-digit inflation cannot be one monsoon, especially when the world's food security depends on it.